All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're taking a look at something that honestly feels like it should be impossible to measure on a spreadsheet: the relationship between a massive industrial project and the actual people who live right next door to it. How does the coal industry translate human friction and community trust into hard, quantifiable data? Well, as we're going to see, the financial world has actually figured out a pretty clever way to track it.
Here is our roadmap for today. We're covering the social license, defining indigenous lands, the 5-kilometer rule, measuring community friction, valuing non-technical delays, and finally, the bottom line.
Section 1. The social license. Let's look at turning human friction into data.
So think about this for a second. If we put community relations under a microscope, we're faced with a really crucial question for investors. How do you actually measure something as abstract as a community's trust or their resistance? It's not a physical commodity, right? It's not like weighing a ton of metallurgical coal, but it has a massive impact on the viability of extracting that coal. Because let's face it, if a local community doesn't want you there, your millions of dollars of heavy equipment might just end up sitting totally idle.
Well, believe it or not, there's a standardized accounting solution for this. The SASB standards actually provide really explicit guidelines that require coal entities to manage and, most importantly, quantify the risks associated with community rights, local interests, and indigenous lands. It basically takes this vague, feel-good concept of being a good neighbor and forces it to become a strictly accountable business metric.
Moving right along to Section 2, defining indigenous lands, or the metrics of proximity.
Before a company can measure its impact, it obviously has to define the territory. So how exactly do we define indigenous peoples for corporate reporting? It's definitely not arbitrary. The standard relies on established definitions from the UN and the International Labor Organization. They identify indigenous lands by looking for a few key characteristics, things like historical continuity with pre-colonial societies and a strong link to the territories and natural resources. We're also looking for distinct social, economic, or political systems, a distinct language or culture, and a shared resolve to maintain those ancestral environments. If those characteristics are present, then the land and its people fall squarely under this reporting framework.
Okay, so once the land is officially defined, we've got to look at the coal itself. Entities are required to report the percentage of their coal reserves that are located in or near these lands. And they have to categorize these reserves strictly as either proved or probable, which is all based on measurement certainty. So, proved reserves require highly detailed sampling, with high certainty exactly what's in the ground. Probable reserves, on the other hand, rely on farther space sampling. There's lower certainty, but there's an assumed continuity of the vein. You have to know exactly what kind of reserves are potentially overlapping with indigenous territories.
Which brings us to Section 3, the 5-kilometer rule, and establishing that boundary.
Now, in the corporate world, a word like near can be pretty squishy, right? Near could mean almost anything, but not here. We zoom into a highly specific, totally rigid metric, a 5-kilometer radius around the recognized boundary of indigenous lands. It is a hard mathematical line. If a mining operation's reserves fall anywhere within this 5-kilometer proximity radius, boom, they trigger the reporting requirement. It doesn't matter if there's a giant mountain or a massive river right in between, 5 kilometers is the magic number.
So the absolutely crucial takeaway here is that companies literally have to calculate the exact tonnage of reserves within this 5-kilometer radius to disclose their percentage of exposed assets. It's a pretty straightforward but incredibly powerful equation. You take the proved and probable reserves within that 5-kilometer boundary, and you divide them by the total global proved and probable reserves the company holds. This simple math gives stakeholders and investors a crystal clear percentage of how much of a company's future product is directly tied to successfully managing indigenous relations.
All right, let's jump into Section 4, measuring community friction and analyzing non-technical delays.
Zooming back out a bit to the broader operational phase, these companies have to manage risks across 4 really specific categories: economic, environmental, social, and cultural interests. Economic rights are all about employment, fair wages, and respecting local agricultural land. Environmental rights cover things like clean local air, water, and safe waste disposal. Social rights touch on adequate healthcare, education, and housing. And finally, cultural rights involve the strict protection of sacred or burial sites. A failure in literally any of these 4 areas by the mining company can trigger immediate pushback from the community. To actually quantify this friction, we contrast the physical, technical delays of mining with non-technical delays, which are driven entirely by human factors. Technical delays are your standard, everyday operational headaches. An excavator breaks down, a drill fails, maybe there's a weird extraction anomaly. We expect those. But non-technical delays, that's the equivalent of the world's most intense neighborhood dispute. These are community protests, pending regulatory permits, intense stakeholder resistance, or even armed conflict. These are delays caused entirely by a breakdown in that social license to operate.
So let's explore that in Section 5, Valuing Non-Technical Delays. We're looking at the anatomy of a shutdown.
Let's put the anatomy of one of these non-technical delays under the microscope to see how they gauge community impact. Say on day 1, a regulatory permit is pending. Pretty normal. But by day 14, a massive community protest starts up, maybe due to environmental concerns. By day 16, things escalate, and the site is completely shut down. Let's say by day 45, the whole issue is finally resolved. The company doesn't just get to write this off as a bad month. No, they have to explicitly calculate that total duration. Every single day of non-technical delay has to be tracked and recorded.
And looking at the official SASB framework, it leaves absolutely no room for ambiguity. Human resistance is directly translated into two hard numbers: the total number of delays and the duration of those delays in days. It is a really stark translation of social tension into a quantitative business metric that investors can track quarter over quarter.
Finally, we reach Section 6, the bottom line. Let's talk about the financial impact of trust.
So we know exactly how this friction is measured now. But why do investors actually care? Well, because failing to manage these relations can trigger permit suspensions and force massive write-downs in the value of the company's reserves. Poor relations can snowball into protests, riots, or armed conflict. And that can lead directly to the suspension of regulatory permits or force a company to shell out substantial compensation or settlement payments. Ultimately, if you can't extract the coal because the community won't let you, the value of those reserves sitting on your balance sheet has to be written down.
Companies even go so far as to calculate their aggregate value at risk by applying a discount rate premium to their cash flow analysis, specifically to account for this community friction. And the math here is brutal. The aggregate value at risk equals the value of the project completely free from risk minus the value adjusted times for these community risks. A lack of community trust literally mathematically devalues the asset. It is a direct, unavoidable hit to the bottom line.
So that leaves us with a pretty big question to ponder. When abstract human rights are mathematically tied to actual capital expenditures, it becomes incredibly clear that a social license to operate isn't just nice to have. It's a fundamental business requirement. You can have the richest coal vein in the world, but if you don't have the community's trust, you just don't have a viable business. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this gives you a whole new perspective on the true value of being a good neighbor. Keep asking questions, and I'll catch you next time.